Good afternoon. Welcome to our overview of CHP and geothermal measures webinar. It's currently 2 p.m., so let's get started. My name is Portia Baldad, and I'm the marketing manager for the Enerva and Summerhill team. Enerva and Summerhill are supporting emissions reduction Alberta with the design and execution of the Energy Savings for Business program. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. There are quite a few people attending today's webinar. As such, all microphones have been muted to avoid interruptions. Throughout the presentation, you can submit questions to our team through the control panel's questions feature. We'll answer those questions during our Q&A period at the end of today's webinar. If you cannot resolve your technical issues or need to leave early, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on the ESB program website. It'll include both the presentation and the Q&A session. Today, we'll begin with a brief program overview, including eligible measures categories. We'll then dig into the CHP and geothermal measures categories, including an introduction to the technologies, key eligibility criteria, and work through the application process. We'll then take a look at emissions and incentives calculations before ending the webinar with a Q&A period. Today, Luca Youngin, Emission Reduction Alberta's Program Manager, will provide a little background on ERA and the Energy Savings for Business program. Then my colleagues Patrick McMahon and Soria Narcia will jump in to guide us through eligible CHP and geothermal measures. Now let's get right into it. Here's Luca to kick off today's presentation.
Thanks, Portia. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions while supporting the economy benefits everyone. ERA's vision is anchored in the belief that our success is measured in both economic and environmental terms. Emissions Reduction Alberta has been investing in Alberta technologies and companies since 2009 to reduce emissions and grow Alberta's economy. Our investments help innovators develop and demonstrate GHG reducing technologies that lower costs, improve competitiveness, and accelerate Alberta's transformation towards decarbonization. We have worked across many sectors and have recently broadened our scope with the Energy Savings for Business program. This program will accelerate the adoption of commercially available technologies that will help businesses cut costs and reduce emissions. Learning from previous programs with similar scope, we have adapted the program to be more streamlined. We know time is money to Alberta businesses and are committed to fast turnaround times. For standard applications, this could be as quick as 2 days. The program has been designed to reflect the realities of the pandemic. Incentive payments will be made electronically, and all program materials are available in a digital downloadable format that can easily be printed by contractors or participants. We've also expanded the measures list to include categories that have not been offered previously, such as geothermal and compressed air. We have also made sure to include measures that are accessible to all businesses, like ceiling and wall insulation, refrigerated case covers, efficient motors, lighting systems, and high-efficiency windows. We'll have over 300 measures to offer in this program. Our most recent measure release included HVAC, water heating, process heating, and building envelope and windows. These measures have now been added to the measures list. In terms of the measure categories we are reviewing today, human beings have been taking advantage of power and heat for centuries, and we've come a long way from using springs and natural vents to cook and clean. These days, modern technologies such as CHP and geothermal are turning heat into electricity to power businesses like yours. We'll continue to host more webinars like this one to help guide contractors and applicants through additional measure categories. Our overview of refrigeration measures is scheduled for March 25th. And if you've missed our past webinars, process heating, compressed air and building envelope, motors and drives, solar and lighting webinars are all now live on our website. To register for future webinars or view recordings of past webinars, please visit eralberta.ca/ESB. Before we get into the details of CHP and geothermal, we wanted to share a quick note about the application process. We are seeing incomplete applications submitted in order to secure funding reservations. Submitting an incomplete application does not secure funding. If a pre-project application is submitted but is not approved, it does not hold a place in line for the incentive reservation. The incentive is only reserved after the pre-project application is approved. It is important to submit good quality applications with complete documentations, or the review cannot occur in a timely manner. If the application is incomplete or is missing key information, it creates delays in the review and approval process, as it will be returned to you for more information. With that said, we're glad you could join us today for an overview of CHP and geothermal measures. I will now pass it off to Patrick and Surya to take you through how to apply for this category of incentives.
Thanks for that context, Luca. I'm Patrick McMahon, the Contractor Experience Manager on the Enerva Summerhill team. We're proud to support Emissions Reduction Alberta through the delivery of the Energy Savings for Business program. Thank you for calling into the webinar today, and thanks for your interest in the program. Today's webinar will cover measures identified under the CHP and geothermal categories from the measures list found on the program website, eralberta.ca/ESB. We'll provide some context on each of the measure category groups and a review of the measure-specific components of the application process. Then, as Portia mentioned, we'll address the common emissions, costs, and incentive aspects of an application before we transition to a Q&A component at the end of the webinar. The first measure category we will review is combined heat and power, or CHP. Let's get started with this interesting measure category. I'm joined by my colleagues, Surya and Arcia, who help me understand these products and their fit within the Energy Savings for Business program. Surya, let's plan to spend some time on the details of the application, which is fairly technical, but can you tell me generally what a CHP system is?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So combined heat and power is also known as cogeneration. It produces electricity and thermal energy on site at the same time. The thermal energy that would otherwise be wasted is usually recovered to heat water, produce steam, for example, which is then used for other processes within the facility. The electricity produced replaces a portion of the amount drawn from the local utility, typically the base load, thus lowering overall cost of energy and also achieving carbon emissions reduction. And depending on the processes within the facility, a CHP could be designed to be either thermal load driven or electrical load driven.
Well, this is really interesting technology for the appropriate application. How common is this?
CHP is quite common. In the US, the US Department of Energy reported over 4,600 sites with CHP installations in 2019. While it is still a costly project, CHPs can significantly contribute towards emissions reductions. And it is well known that in Alberta, there is a wide utilization of reciprocating engines, for example, which represent significant potential for CHP applications. There are other options as well, which are available. And this is why the ESB program is providing these incentives to encourage businesses go the extra mile and consider investing in CHP projects if that's applicable for your business.
Thanks, Surya. Could you share the critical eligibility considerations before we walk through the application?
Yes, absolutely. So to qualify for the ESB program, the project must comply with the microgeneration regulation and must be connected to the grid. We will be asking all the relevant documentation for that. Both internal combustion engines and turbines are eligible for this program. The system must be designed such that the thermal energy produced by the electricity generation process is being used within the facility, all of that. The overall system efficiency combining both electricity and thermal energy utilization must be at least 50% to qualify. And additionally, the system utilization factor must also be at least 85%. As far as the design is concerned, it is important that it is approved and signed by a professional engineer that's licensed to practice in Alberta. There are also a series of other requirements for eligibility, which are found in section 4.6 of the participants' terms and conditions, which we strongly encourage everyone to review. And we're also pleased to let you know that new constructions are also eligible in the case of CHP. With that said, we would like to draw your attention at that this program is due to wrap up in Q2 of next year. So if you have projects in the pipeline, they should not be delayed. When, excuse me, when applying for the incentives, you will have to submit the engineering and specification sheets for the proposed new genset, as well as all the new ancillary equipment that comes with it. You must also provide Form A along with all the supporting documents that you would typically submit for a microgen application. This would include a single line diagram as well as PI and D drawings. When the review process has advanced and reached the post-application stage, we will request you for the microgen approval as well as a signed copy of the agreement. The annual electrical and thermal loads are also required. We're going to elaborate a little bit on that in the later slides. You must also provide the name of the professional engineer that is signing off the project and the name of the firm as well. And lastly, you must also provide an estimate of the annual hours of operation and an estimate of the building square footage.
Thanks, Surya. Let's jump into the application process for CHP. The addition of a CHP measure starts with the selection of CHP under the measure category dropdown once Add Measure has been clicked from step 4 of the pre-approval application process. Measures can be added by the participant who is responsible for starting and ultimately submitting a complete application. The participant can enable the eligible contractor they selected earlier in the application process to assist with the measure definition on the project at their discretion. For technical measures such as CHP, this might be especially beneficial. There is only one option under the measure type within the CHP category, but 2 options for the specific measure with different incentive rates depending on the system efficiency. With the appropriate system efficiency selected, the application form for CHP opens up. Like all measure additions, the quantity is the first field, and for CHP projects, enter this as 1. Surya mentioned that CHP is eligible for new construction, and you'll need to identify if the application is a retrofit to an existing facility or intended to be installed with the construction of the facility. The primary mover is a drop-down including internal combustion engine or turbine driven. The status of the interconnection application must be identified, and the Form A of the interconnection agreement is a required attachment and next in the application form. The use of thermal energy is required to be identified, hot water, process steam, space heating, or a combination, before noting the engineering firm and engineer name affiliated with the design of the project. The identification of the building type is also a dropdown, including a variety of common building uses and other if none of the listed uses reflect the actual use adequately. The total facility area in square feet and the annual operating hours of the facility round out some of the more general application requirements. The application requires information about the base year electrical consumption of the facility. The program requests electrical use data in an Excel format to be able to recreate a profile of electrical demand at the facility. There are 2 options for the granularity of the data that might be available from the facility, looking back. This, of course, is for retrofit applications only, and new construction projects will likely rely on modeling estimates to satisfy this requirement. Ideally, and indicated in this example, would be hourly utility data for the base year. Another option is to provide a data set that supports plotting of daily electricity consumption for the facility. Once plotted, such a chart will identify highs and lows in consumption through the base year as presented in this example. Critically, the data is the requirement and the review team will plot the data to evaluate the application. It is up to the user to identify what data is available and most convenient to provide. If there are challenges in this context, please follow up to discuss other options based on extrapolation or modeling tolerances to satisfy this application requirement. Like the electricity consumption profile, the application also requires information about the base year thermal energy consumption of the facility. The program requests thermal demand in Excel format to be able to recreate a heating demand profile of the facility. Again, there are 2 options for the granularity of the data that might be available from the facility. Looking back, again, new construction projects will rely on modeling to help the review team confirm that the system is sized appropriately for the expected or known demands of the facility. Ideally, and indicated in this example, would be hourly heating fuel consumption data for the base year. Another option to provide a data set that supports plotting of daily fuel consumption for the facility, such that a chart will identify highs and lows for the base year as presented in this example. Critically, the data is the requirement, and the review team will plot the data to evaluate the application. It's up to the user to identify what data is available and most convenient to provide. In the cases where there may be gaps in data from an access or granularity perspective, or if there is a need to discuss a path to satisfy these requirements, please reach out. We understand that there may be issues that will need to be coordinated on a case-by-case basis. Other strategies we'll tolerate may include extrapolation or modeling to identify the base electrical and heating demands of the facility. This data is collected through the application process to support the review team looking to confirm that the project is appropriately sized. Carrying on with the application, a brief description of the CHP project is required. This will help the review team understand the context of submission details to have a more fulsome picture of the project based on the balance of the information provided through the application. The rated electrical capacity, which is the CHP system size in kilowatts, and the rated usable thermal capacity of the system are required inputs. Since a Form A application is required for application, which requires a single line electrical drawing, this component of the Form A application is specifically required as an attachment to upload by dragging the file into the gray area or clicking to prompt the opportunity to explore to find the file to add to the application. We expect that the requirements in this form reflect known variables or resources developed through the design of these systems. This includes the piping and instrumentation diagram, which is required as a specific attachment. Capacity in kilowatts was previously provided. Here, design annual electrical output in kilowatt hours is required. Similar is true for anticipated usable thermal energy output in MMBTU. The estimated annual uptime is also required between 0 and 8,760 hours. The engineering spec sheet for the genset is a required attachment, as is the heat recovery engineering spec sheet. The final application questions ask the user to confirm if the overall system efficiency is over 60% to ensure that the correct measure selection has been completed, recalling that there are different incentive rates for systems between 50 and 60% and those over 60% efficiency. The overall design CHP system efficiency is also required to be specified. The user will confirm that the CHP system utilization factor is greater than 85%. And yes will be the required selection for this question. Recall from Surya's summary of eligibility criteria that the minimum system efficiency of 50% and minimum utilization factor of 85% are specific eligibility criteria for this measure. The final fields reflect calculated emissions reductions, project cost disclosure, and incentive calculations. These are common elements of all measure additions and will be covered after we review the geothermal measure. Our next measure category to cover today is geothermal, or geo-exchange systems. These systems are for space and water heating and cooling, and not electrical generation. Surya, can you tell me about geothermal in the context of energy savings for business?
Yes, absolutely. As you rightly said, this is in the case of the ESB, they are for space, water, heating, and cooling. So geothermal heat pumps, typically also called the ground source heat pumps, are used in general for space heating and cooling, sometimes also for water heating. The benefits of ground source heat pumps is that they utilize naturally existing heat from under the ground as compared to producing heat through the combustion of fossil fuels. So that's very beneficial. The program is incentivizing projects at the rate of $2,500 per ton, and it would cap at a maximum of 200 tons.
Thanks. Is this actually a practical solution?
Indeed, it really is. Much of the cost of geo-exchange systems relate to installing the loop required to collect the heat from under the ground. The loop can be buried either vertically or horizontally, depending on the situation. Either way, there are appropriate equipment to excavate and install the pipes. It is a very efficient system and a clean source of energy, as well as very reliable because temperature of the earth underground, just a few feet below the freezing mark, is rather constant.
Excellent. Can you remind us of the eligibility requirements for this measure category?
Yes, so to be eligible for this measure, the system must be designed so that all the thermal energy be used within the facility. Geothermal or ground source heat pumps must comply with the ANSI or CSA certification, and the design must be signed and approved by a professional engineer that's licensed to practice in Alberta and is also accredited as a certified geo-exchange designer by the International Ground Source Heat Pump Association or equivalent. The system must also be installed by an installer who is accredited by the International Ground Source Heat Pump Association or an equivalent organization. And there are also a number of other requirements for eligibility, which can be found in section 4.6 of the participants' terms and conditions, which we strongly encourage everyone to review.
Thanks, Surya. Let's take a tour through the application process for a geothermal project. Apologies in advance for switching between geothermal, GSHP, or geo-exchange terminology through the following slides. This application review and the others in the webinar begins after the Add Measure button has been clicked through the Measure and Project Summary stage of an application. This is available to the participant or their contractor if the participant enabled access for the contractor earlier in the application process. There's only one measure within the geothermal category, so the user will need to select geothermal a few times to get to the measure-specific considerations. Once selected, the measure-specific requirements for the addition of a geothermal measure come up, starting with quantity, which for geothermal should always be 1. Since geothermal is not restricted to the built environment, the user can identify if the application is for heating and cooling retrofit of an existing facility, or if the application is for a facility to be constructed. The building size in square feet is required, and the heating source in place, expected, or intended to back up the geo-exchange system is required to be selected from the dropdown. A similar question is asked as it relates to the existing or proposed energy source for domestic hot water supply. There's an opportunity to identify other energy efficiency measures that may have been executed prior to the installation of the geo-exchange system and the capital costs associated with these investments. This cost is not considered in defining the total eligible cost associated with a geothermal measure by way of calculation in the application process, nor are these costs eligible for consideration in specifying the eligible cost of the geothermal project that would be entered later. These costs may reflect eligible costs for other eligible projects, but should not be considered as costs for the geo-exchange system installation. You'll need to identify the soil thermal conductivity between 2 options and identify the bore field spacing. The next required field is the selection from a dropdown of the GSHP efficiency between low, medium, and high, then input the coefficient of performance of the system. The GSHP nameplate capacity in tons is required, and the estimated cost of drilling. If supplemental cooling is installed or intended to be installed, note the COP or EER of this equipment as applicable, and select from the drop-down to identify if it would be characterized as low, medium, or high efficiency. For alternative heating, note the efficiency of this equipment as applicable, and again characterize this as low, medium, or highly efficient. The application form requires an indication of the cost of electricity in dollars per kilowatt hour for the facility, or the assumed rate, and the heating cost fuel in dollars per unit with a drop-down selection for the unit of measure based on the fuel source used for heating. The final document requirements are expected to be outcomes of heat pump selection and the engineering design. The documents required to be attached to the application include the specification sheet for the heat pump and in-ground items including casement material and piping. The system design report, energy model output, and schematic for the field site plan are required supporting documents, which will be critical to the review team to evaluate the application. All of these attachments can be dragged into the gray areas or clicked on to launch an Explorer to find and add the correct files. If additional documentation is required to support the application that cannot be accommodated through the measure addition itself, add these additional supporting documents during step 5 of the application process, where documents regarding the entire project that may include multiple measures are added. This brings us to the common emissions and cost section of the measure addition module when adding measures to an application. The per unit emissions reduction reflects the assumed per measure emissions reduction, and the total emissions reduction reflects an emissions reduction estimate based on some of the measure-specific variables entered through the measure addition sections that have been covered through the application creation, which has been demonstrated earlier. This will be calculated when the user ultimately clicks on Get Calculated Values at the bottom of the measure addition module. This is the place to input measure costs, separated by equipment and material costs, labor costs, and design costs. If multiple measures will be included on a single application, costs such as labor for installations or eligible design or audit costs should be allocated across the various measures to be included in the application. Where costs are allocated across multiple measures on an application, it would be helpful as a tip to share how costs were allocated in a document added at step 5 in the application process. Please note that labor costs should only reflect costs associated with installation, while other costs, excluding equipment and material costs, should be allocated to the design cost field. The rebate application will calculate 3 values relating to the incentive when the Get Calculated Values button is ultimately clicked. Understanding these values in the context of the program may be helpful. The first is the measure incentive, which is the per unit incentive multiplied by the eligible quantity of measures being added through the specific measure addition. For CHP, this is based on $1 per kilowatt capacity of the system, and for geothermal is based on $1 per ton. The maximum eligible measure incentive reflects the incentive cap applied to the sum of eligible costs, material, installation, and design costs. For example, if the sum of costs was $100,000 and the incentive cap was defined at 50%, the maximum eligible incentive would calculate to $50,000. The total eligible measure incentive is the lower of the maximum eligible measure incentive or the measure incentive. After the Get Calculated Values button is clicked, the application will identify any missing fields. If all the fields are present, take the opportunity to review the measures set to be added for accuracy before clicking to add the measure to the application. This process from specific measure definition, cost allocation, and review is repeated for other measures to be included as a part of the project at the facility included in a single application.